In the late 20th century, liberal political philosophy experienced a major internal debate over the proper scope of state authority. At the center of that debate stood Robert Nozick, whose 1974 work Anarchy, State, and Utopia became the most influential philosophical defense of libertarianism in modern political theory. Nozick's project was not merely economic or policy-oriented. It was a moral argument about political authority itself. He sought to answer a foundational question. What, if anything, may the state legitimately do without violating individual rights? His answer was stark and uncompromising: very little. The moral starting point: individuals as rights holders. Nozick begins with a moral premise that is distinctly Lockean but sharpened into a rigorous libertarian framework. Individuals possess inviolable rights. These rights function as moral side constraints on how others, including the state, may treat them. For Nozick, individuals are not resources to be used for social goals. They are ends in themselves, possessing moral claims that cannot be overridden simply because doing so would improve aggregate outcomes. This places Nozick in direct opposition to utilitarianism, which evaluates policies by their consequences for overall happiness or welfare. His famous formulation captures this point succinctly. There are things no person or government may do to another without violating their rights, regardless of how beneficial the outcome might be. Rejection of redistributive justice. One of Nozick's most controversial claims is his rejection of redistributive justice. He argues that taxation for redistributive purposes is morally equivalent to forced labor. When the state takes the fruits of an individual's labor to support others, it effectively claims partial ownership over that individual's time and effort. In Nozick's framework, justice is not about achieving patterned outcomes such as equality, fairness, or need-based distribution. Instead, justice is historical and procedural. A distribution of resources is just if and only if it arises through just acquisition, legitimate initial ownership, just transfer, voluntary exchange or gift, rectification, correction of past injustices, if any. If these conditions are met, the resulting distribution, no matter how unequal, is morally legitimate. Any attempt by the state to correct inequalities that arise from free exchange constitutes a rights violation. The minimal state, the night watchman government. Nozick famously defends what he calls the minimal state, sometimes described as a night watchman state. This is the only form of state he believes can be morally justified. The legitimate functions of the state are limited to protection against force, theft, and fraud enforcement of contracts, provision of courts and legal adjudication. Anything beyond these functions, such as welfare programs, public education, healthcare provision, or cultural funding, exceeds the moral authority of the state. Crucially, Nozick does not argue for anarchism. He accepts that a minimal state can arise without violating rights, through voluntary processes of protection and association. However, once established, that state must remain strictly limited or risk becoming morally illegitimate. Opposition to paternalism and the nanny state. Nozick is deeply skeptical of paternalistic government action. He rejects the idea that the state may intervene in individuals' lives for their own good, even when such intervention appears beneficial. From a libertarian perspective, individuals are the best judges of their own interests. State efforts to regulate behavior, whether through compulsory education, health mandates, or moral legislation, treat individuals as means to collective ends rather than autonomous agents. This position places Nozick in direct opposition to modern liberal theories that justify state intervention on grounds of social welfare, equality of opportunity, or human development. Nozick versus Rawls. A defining debate. Much of Anarchy, State, and Utopia is best understood as a sustained critique of John Rawls's theory of justice, where Rawls argues that inequalities are acceptable only if they benefit the least advantaged. Nozick insists that patterns of distribution are morally irrelevant if they require coercive interference. Nozick's famous Wilt Chamberlain example illustrates this point. If individuals voluntarily choose to pay a famous athlete, resulting in inequality, the resulting distribution is just, regardless of whether it aligns with any egalitarian pattern. To undo that inequality would require violating the very freedoms that produced it. Thus, Nozick reframes justice away from outcomes and toward respect for individual choice. Implications for liberalism and American political thought. Nozick's work reasserted a strong property-based conception of freedom within the liberal tradition. He provided philosophical depth to libertarian political movements, particularly in the United States, and influenced debates over taxation, welfare, regulation, and the moral limits of government. While critics argue that his theory neglects structural inequality and social dependency, Nozick's enduring contribution lies in forcing political theory to confront a difficult truth. Any expansion of state power carries moral costs. Conclusion: liberty as a moral constraint. Robert Nozick articulated one of the most uncompromising defenses of individual liberty in modern political philosophy. His vision of the minimal state challenges both progressive and conservative expansions of government authority and reminds us that freedom is not merely a policy preference, it is a moral boundary. Whether one ultimately accepts or rejects Nozick's conclusions, his work remains essential for understanding libertarianism, liberalism's internal tensions, and the enduring question of how much power the state may rightfully claim.